November 12, 1943. A freezing rain washes over the stone gargoyles of Rome, but the air is thick with the metallic scent of wet wool and engine oil. The silence of the Aurelian Way is shattered by the screech of heavy trucks. SS soldiers, led by the cold-eyed Colonel Hans Dietrich von Kessler, are tearing through the Via del Portico district, herding terrified families toward the waiting cattle cars at the Ostiense terminal. While the world holds its breath, a tall, imposing figure stands at the threshold of St. Peter's Square, the embers of his pipe glowing like a signal fire in the dark. He is Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, a man whose 6'2" frame and booming Irish laugh usually dominate the golf courses of the Roman elite. He was never meant for the trenches. He was a man of fine wine and finer diplomacy. But as he watches a child's doll trampled into the Roman mud by a jackboot, O'Flaherty realizes that neutrality is no longer an option. Under the very nose of the Führer's most ruthless executioners, he establishes the Angel's Shadow, a clandestine railroad of priests and poets. He becomes the Vatican's Ghost of Rome, a master of theater who dances on the edge of a bayonet to save 4,000 lives. 3 months earlier, the Vatican was still a sanctuary of silk and ceremony. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty was the darling of Roman high society, a man who could quote Dante over dinner and sink a birdie on the 18th hole before afternoon prayers. His apartment overlooking the Tiber was filled with first-edition volumes and bottles of Tuscan wine that lesser clerics could only dream about. Diplomats sought his counsel. Cardinals envied his ease with languages. He spoke 7 fluently, switching between Italian, German, French, and English with the grace of a conductor leading an orchestra.
But O'Flaherty was no mere socialite in vestments. Born in County Cork, Ireland in 1918, he had witnessed the brutality of occupation firsthand during the Irish War of Independence. He understood what it meant to live under the boot of an empire that saw you as less than human. That understanding lay dormant through years of diplomatic cocktail parties and Vatican politics, buried beneath layers of practiced charm and ecclesiastical protocol. He had convinced himself that his calling was to serve through diplomacy, to be a bridge between worlds rather than a soldier in the trenches. The golf courses of Rome became his second home. Every Thursday afternoon, O'Flaherty would meet with a rotating cast of ambassadors, wealthy industrialists, and military attachés for rounds that were equal parts sport and intelligence gathering. He learned more about the political temperature of occupied Europe over 18 holes than most spies learned in months of clandestine operations. His handicap was impressive, but his real skill was making powerful men feel comfortable enough to speak freely in his presence. His evenings were spent in drawing rooms thick with cigarette smoke and political intrigue. O'Flaherty had mastered the art of listening, of asking the right question at the right moment, of reading the subtle tensions between dinner guests. He could detect a lie in the pause before someone answered. He understood that information was currency in wartime Rome, and he had become wealthy in that particular economy without ever betraying his position as a Vatican official.
The illusion shattered on the evening of September 8, 1943, when Italy surrendered to the Allies and Nazi Germany transformed from ally to occupier overnight. Within hours, German troops flooded into Rome like a dark tide. O'Flaherty watched from his window as tanks rolled past the ancient columns of the Forum, their tread scarring cobblestones that had survived 2,000 years of history. The laughter at dinner parties grew forced, the wine tasted bitter, and then came the lists,
long bureaucratic inventories of names marked for deportation. O'Flaherty received his first desperate knock on the door 3 days after the occupation began. A Jewish surgeon named Dr. Emanuel Rossi stood trembling in the hallway, his medical bag clutched to his chest like a shield. His family had been taken in the night. The Gestapo had given him until morning to report for relocation. The doctor's hands shook as he explained that he had delivered 3 of O'Flaherty's diplomatic friends' children, that he had served Rome's elite for 20 years, and now those same elites had closed their doors to him. O'Flaherty looked into the man's terrified eyes and saw not a stranger, but a reflection of every Irishman who had ever hidden from British patrols in the hills of Cork. Without hesitation, he pulled Rossi inside, hid him in a storage room behind a false wall, and began making calls to trusted contacts. That single act of defiance set in motion a cascade that would transform the diplomatic priest into something far more dangerous, a resistance leader operating in plain sight.
November 12th arrived like a funeral procession. O'Flaherty had spent weeks quietly relocating vulnerable families to convents and monasteries across Rome, relying on the Vatican's neutrality as a paper-thin shield. But Colonel Hans Dietrich von Kessler had other plans. A veteran of the Eastern Front with ice-blue eyes that never blinked, von Kessler was assigned to Rome with one mandate: eliminate all threats to German security, real or imagined. To him, every Jewish family was a potential partisan cell. Every act of mercy was treason against the Reich. Von Kessler had earned his reputation in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, where he had commanded units that showed neither mercy nor hesitation. He approached his assignment in Rome with the same mechanical efficiency he had applied to the Eastern Front. The colonel believed deeply in order, in the purity of following commands without the contamination of conscience. He saw himself not as evil, but necessary, a surgical instrument wielded by history itself. That night, von Kessler unleashed the Black Guard on the Via del Cortico district. O'Flaherty heard the screams from his apartment and ran toward them, his cassock billowing behind him like the wings of some avenging angel. What he found turned his blood to ice. Families were being dragged from their homes, children torn from their mothers' arms, elderly men beaten with rifle butts for moving too slowly. The rain mixed with blood on the cobblestones. A young girl, no more than 7, stood crying over a trampled doll while an SS officer kicked it further into the mud, laughing at her anguish. O'Flaherty stepped forward, his 6'2" frame seeming even taller in the flickering streetlight. He positioned himself between the officer and the child, speaking in perfect German with an edge sharp enough to cut steel. He informed the soldier that the girl was now under Vatican protection, that she was a baptized Catholic whose family served the church. It was a lie, delivered with such absolute conviction that the officer hesitated. The Monsignor's voice carried the weight of institutional authority, the kind that made even hardened soldiers second-guess their orders.
In that moment of uncertainty, O'Flaherty scooped up the child and walked away, fully expecting a bullet in his back with each step. The little girl buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, rapid as a trapped bird. Behind him, he heard the officer shouting questions, heard boots on wet cobblestones, but the bullet never came. From a staff car parked in the shadows, von Kessler watched the Irish priest disappear into the darkness with his contraband. The colonel lit a cigarette and smiled, not with pleasure, but with the grim satisfaction of a hunter who had finally identified worthy prey. He had found his opponent, and the game that would define both their futures had officially begun. By dawn, O'Flaherty had moved the girl and 14 other survivors to a forgotten cistern beneath the Trastevere district. The space was damp and cold, water dripping from ancient Roman brickwork, but it was invisible to Nazi patrols. As he arranged blankets and distributed what little food he had scrounged, O'Flaherty realized that improvisation would no longer suffice. If he was going to wage war against the machinery of genocide, he needed organization, strategy, and allies willing to risk everything.
Building a resistance network inside occupied Rome required more than courage. It demanded the cunning of a chess master and the faith of a martyr. O'Flaherty began recruiting carefully, selecting individuals whose motivations he could trust absolutely. Each potential member underwent weeks of observation before receiving an invitation into the inner circle. Trust was the only currency that mattered, and it had to be earned through demonstrated action rather than empty promises. There was Father Giovanni Palazzini, a nervous young priest with a photographic memory who could forge documents with stunning accuracy. Giovanni had studied art restoration before entering seminary, and his eye for detail made him invaluable. He could replicate the precise shade of ink used in official documents, could age paper with tea and smoke until it looked decades old, could forge signatures so perfectly that even banking officials couldn't detect the deception. There was Henrietta Chevalier, a Maltese widow who ran a boarding house near the Spanish Steps and could hide people in plain sight among her ordinary tenants. Henrietta had lost her husband to the fascists in 1941, and her grief had calcified into something harder than diamond. She transformed her 4-story establishment into a masterpiece of concealment, with false walls, hidden staircases, and a sophisticated system of signals that could alert hidden refugees to danger within seconds. And there was British Major Sam Derry, an escaped prisoner of war whom O'Flaherty smuggled into the Vatican disguised as a gardening monk. Derry brought military tactical knowledge that the priests and civilians lacked. He understood patrol patterns, communication protocols, and how to organize operations with military precision. His experience planning escapes from POW camps proved invaluable in designing routes through hostile territory. Together, they transformed the old Roman cistern into a functioning sanctuary. The space stretched through a network of ancient tunnels, originally built to carry water to the imperial baths. O'Flaherty mapped every passage, every hidden exit that opened into convents, churches, and even a bakery whose Catholic owner asked no questions. They established the Sanctuary Corridor, a route through Rome that could move refugees from safe houses to the Vatican under cover of darkness, using prearranged signals and couriers disguised as everything from nuns to cold deliverers. The corridor operated on a system of coded phrases and visual signals. A red cloth hanging from a particular window meant danger. A specific chalk mark on a doorpost indicated a safe house. Couriers carried messages hidden in hollowed-out prayer books, in the false bottoms of wine bottles, even sewn into the linings of their clothing. The network communicated through layers of insulation so that if one member was captured, they could only betray their immediate contacts, not the entire operation. But the operation needed resources: money for forged documents, food for the hidden, medicine for the sick. O'Flaherty leveraged every connection he had cultivated during his years as a socialite. He convinced wealthy Roman Catholics to donate under the guise of charity work, appealing to their faith while carefully avoiding details that might endanger them.
He guilt-tripped Swiss diplomats into providing cash from their discretionary funds, reminding them of their commitment to humanitarian principles. He even charmed American OSS agents into funneling supplies through Vatican channels, convincing them that his network provided valuable intelligence on German movements. Within weeks, the Angel's shadow was sheltering over 200 people across a dozen locations. But success brought danger.
Von Kessler was no fool. He knew that refugees were disappearing at an impossible rate. He began assigning Gestapo agents to watch the Vatican's perimeter, establishing the Red Line, a boundary of white paint literally drawn across the pavement where Vatican sovereignty ended and Nazi jurisdiction began. Signs were posted in German and Italian. Crossing this line without authorization will result in immediate arrest or execution. If you can't stand people who hunt the innocent like animals, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type, "Nobody deserves that." Because what happened next only got worse. The Red Line became O'Flaherty's greatest challenge. He could no longer simply walk refugees to safety. Every movement had to be orchestrated like a ballet. And von Kessler was watching, always watching, waiting for the Irish priest to make a mistake that would justify dragging him across that painted border and putting a bullet in his skull.
To outmaneuver an enemy, you must first understand him. O'Flaherty decided that the best way to comprehend von Kessler's operations was to walk directly into the lion's den. The colonel had established his headquarters at the Hotel Imperial, a once elegant establishment near the Trevi Fountain that now housed the machinery of Nazi administration. Gestapo agents conducted interrogations in the basement. Wehrmacht officers planned operations in the ballroom. And somewhere in that building were the deportation schedules, lists that could tell O'Flaherty which neighborhoods would be raided next. The Monsignor concocted an audacious plan. He obtained a postal worker's uniform from a sympathetic Italian courier who had been fired for suspected resistance sympathies. The uniform came complete with cap, satchel, and identification papers that Father Giovanni had painstakingly forged over 3 sleepless nights. O'Flaherty padded his cheeks with cotton to alter his facial structure and affected a limp that changed his distinctive gait. He practiced the role for days, studying how postal workers moved, how they spoke, the peculiar mixture of deference and bureaucratic authority they projected. On a gray Tuesday morning, Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty walked through the front doors of Gestapo headquarters delivering mail. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady as he signed the delivery log. The guard at the entrance barely glanced at him, too bored by routine to notice anything unusual. The performance required absolute control. O'Flaherty shuffled through corridors lined with uniformed killers, nodding deferentially, muttering in Italian-accented German about delayed shipments and bureaucratic incompetence. He delivered letters to offices on the 3rd floor, his eyes cataloging every detail: which doors had guards, which rooms held filing cabinets, where the telephone lines ran. In the officers' lounge, he overheard 2 Gestapo agents complaining about an upcoming raid on the Jewish quarter scheduled for the following Thursday. They spoke carelessly, assuming that a lowly postal worker either couldn't understand German or wouldn't dare repeat what he heard.
But it was in von Kessler's outer office that O'Flaherty struck gold. The colonel was out conducting inspections, and his secretary had stepped away for lunch, leaving her desk unattended. O'Flaherty placed the mail on her desk
and in the 30 seconds he had before footsteps echoed down the hall, he photographed 3 pages of documents with a miniature camera concealed in his postal satchel. The camera was a gift from the OSS agents, a marvel of American engineering no larger than a cigarette case. The pages contained transport schedules, safe houses the Nazis had identified, and, most chilling, a memo marked Final Solution, Roman Implementation. The document detailed plans for the systematic deportation of Rome's remaining Jewish population, complete with quotas and timetables. O'Flaherty's blood ran cold as he read the bureaucratic language that treated human lives as accounting entries. O'Flaherty walked out of the Hotel Imperial exactly as he had entered, unremarkable and unnoticed, but he carried information that would save hundreds of lives and deepen the deadly game between him and the colonel. That night, he developed the photographs in a makeshift darkroom in the Vatican's basement, and the network began evacuating every location the Nazis had identified.
Every network had a breaking point, and O'Flaherty's came in the form of betrayal. Father Marco Benedetti was a junior priest at a parish near the Colosseum, a young man with earnest eyes and a stutter that made him seem harmless. O'Flaherty had recruited him to serve as a courier, delivering messages between safe houses. Father Marco seemed perfect for the role, unassuming, dedicated, and motivated by genuine compassion for the suffering he witnessed daily. What the Monsignor didn't know was that Father Marco's family was held in a detention center outside Rome. Von Kessler had made him an offer delivered with clinical precision. Betray the network and they would live. Refuse, and he would watch them die one by one. The colonel understood that breaking a man's conscience required identifying what he valued more than principle. For Father Marco, that was family. The trap was sprung on a Wednesday evening. Father Marco led Gestapo agents to a safe house in the Trastevere district where 23 refugees were hiding in a wine cellar beneath a sympathetic merchant's shop. The raid was swift and brutal. By the time O'Flaherty received word, the building was surrounded and the refugees were being loaded onto trucks. Among them were families he had personally promised to protect, including Dr. Rossi, the surgeon who had been his first rescue months earlier. O'Flaherty stood in the shadows across the street, his hands clenched so tightly around his rosary that his knuckles went white. He watched von Kessler himself supervise the operation, the colonel's pale face illuminated by the headlights of military vehicles. Von Kessler moved with the precision of a surgeon, directing his men with quiet efficiency. And then O'Flaherty saw Father Marco standing behind von Kessler, his tears streaming down his face but saying nothing, a living monument to the impossible choices that war forces on decent people. The fury that rose in O'Flaherty's chest was matched only by his tactical clarity. He had one night to move every remaining refugee before von Kessler used the captured prisoners to break the entire network under interrogation. O'Flaherty activated emergency protocols, sending runners to every safe house with the code phrase, "The shepherd has lost his flock." It meant abandon current locations immediately and converge on the one place von Kessler couldn't touch, the crypts beneath St. Peter's Basilica itself. What followed was a logistical miracle born of desperation. Through a network of trusted contacts, O'Flaherty moved over 200 people across Rome in the span of 6 hours. Refugees traveled in groups of 3 or 4, disguised as mourners attending late-night vigils, as sanitation workers finishing their shifts, as anything that wouldn't draw attention in a city under curfew.
They entered the Vatican through 7 different access points, a maintenance tunnel here, a delivery entrance there, a forgotten door in an ancient wall that most Romans had forgotten existed. The operation required split-second timing and nerves of steel. One group passed a Gestapo patrol with less than 5 feet between them, saved only by the fact that they were dressed as nuns accompanying an elderly patient to the Vatican's medical clinic. Another group hid in the back of a wine delivery truck that was stopped and searched, the refugees holding their breath behind false panels while German soldiers examined bottles in the front of the vehicle. By dawn, the crypts beneath St. Peter's housed a small city of displaced souls, huddled among the tombs of ancient popes and illuminated by flickering candles. O'Flaherty had won the night, but he had lost 23 lives and the trust he had freely given. The war had become personal in a way that no amount of prayer could absolve. And Father Marco? He disappeared into the chaos of occupied Rome, his 30 pieces of silver paid in the coin of his family's temporary freedom and his own eternal shame. His family was released, as von Kessler had promised, but Father Marco never wore his collar again. Some said he fled to the countryside. Others claimed he drank himself to death in anonymous taverns. O'Flaherty never spoke his name again.
3 weeks after the Judas betrayal, O'Flaherty received an unexpected invitation. Colonel Hans Dietrich von Kessler requested the pleasure of Monsignor O'Flaherty's company for dinner at the Hotel Imperial. The invitation was handwritten on expensive stationery, polite to the point of mockery, and impossible to refuse without causing a diplomatic incident that could endanger the Vatican's precarious neutrality. O'Flaherty understood the game immediately. Von Kessler wanted to unsettle him, to probe for weaknesses, perhaps to extract a confession through psychological warfare. The invitation itself was a power play, forcing the Monsignor onto enemy territory, reminding him that the colonel could reach out and touch him whenever he desired. But von Kessler had made a tactical error. He assumed that his opponent was merely a priest playing at espionage. He didn't comprehend that Hugh O'Flaherty had been navigating the shark-infested waters of Vatican politics for 2 decades. Mind games were his native language. If you believe that compassion is stronger than cruelty, hit that subscribe button. People like von Kessler won't, and you need to hear what O'Flaherty did about it. The dinner was a masterclass in veiled hostility. The private dining room was decorated with looted art from Jewish homes, a detail von Kessler surely intended O'Flaherty to notice. The colonel served Rhenish wine and spoke of his childhood in Bavaria, of his love for classical music, of his belief that war was a regrettable necessity imposed by history rather than chosen by men. He painted himself as a tragic figure, a man of culture forced by duty to perform distasteful tasks. O'Flaherty matched him move for move, discussing theology, quoting Goethe in perfect German, and never once acknowledging the elephant in the room, that one man at the table was dedicated to preserving life while the other was an architect of annihilation. He complimented the wine while ignoring its provenance. He admired a painting on the wall while knowing it had been stripped from someone's home before they were stripped of their lives.
The conversation danced around truth like boxers circling in a ring. Von Kessler spoke of order and duty. O'Flaherty countered with parables about mercy and judgment. Neither man said what they truly meant, but both understood perfectly. The subtext was clear. I know who you are, I know what you're doing, and I will not stop. But while the verbal chess match continued over veal and asparagus, O'Flaherty's real operation was unfolding 3 floors above. Major Sam Derry, disguised as a hotel maintenance worker, complete with tool belt and work orders, was photographing the contents of von Kessler's office safe. The colonel had carelessly left it unlocked in his arrogance, never imagining that his dinner guest would have the audacity to rob him while sitting at his table. The documents inside detailed the locations of every known partisan cell in central Italy, information the Allies desperately needed. Derry worked with practiced efficiency, photographing each page, returning everything to its exact position, leaving no trace of his intrusion. The operation required perfect timing. If the dinner ended too quickly, Derry would be trapped in the office. If it went too long, von Kessler might notice something amiss. The dinner concluded with brandy and a chilling exchange. Von Kessler leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass, and said, "You know, Monsignor, I admire your commitment to your flock. But sheep who wander outside the shepherd's protection often find themselves devoured by wolves. Nature is quite unforgiving to those who violate her boundaries." O'Flaherty met his gaze without flinching and replied, "Colonel, in my experience, wolves who underestimate the shepherd usually discover that he carries a staff for a reason, and that staff, when wielded with conviction, can break even the strongest jaw." They parted with handshakes and smiles that never reached their eyes. Each man knew that the war between them had entered a new phase, more personal, more dangerous, and rapidly approaching a final confrontation.
Not all operations ended in psychological victories. A week after the dinner, O'Flaherty orchestrated a supply transfer that went catastrophically wrong. A sympathetic Italian shopkeeper named Giuseppe Lombardi had agreed to hide forged documents in shipments of olive oil barrels being delivered to a convent. Giuseppe ran a small grocery in the Monte district, and his establishment had served as a crucial node in the network's supply chain for months. But the Gestapo had been watching Giuseppe for weeks, suspecting his involvement with resistance activities. They had noticed the unusual volume of deliveries to religious establishments, had observed the suspicious coincidence of his customers who seemed more interested in quiet conversations than in purchasing goods. Von Kessler had ordered surveillance, and his patience had finally paid off. The raid came at sunset, just as O'Flaherty was personally overseeing the transfer in Giuseppe's storeroom. The Monsignor had insisted on being present because this particular batch of documents was too sensitive to entrust to couriers. They contained the complete list of network members and safe houses intended for Allied intelligence. Gestapo agents burst into the shop with weapons drawn, and chaos erupted in the confined space. O'Flaherty grabbed a satchel containing the most sensitive documents and ran, his cassock abandoned in favor of a worker's jacket that Giuseppe shoved into his hands with a shouted instruction to run and never look back. Behind him, the shop exploded in gunfire as Giuseppe bought time with his life, firing an old hunting rifle at the agents before being cut down in a hail of bullets. The shopkeeper's sacrifice gave O'Flaherty the seconds he needed to reach the back door and crash into the alley beyond. What followed was a desperate chase across the rooftops of Rome. O'Flaherty climbed fire escapes and leaped between buildings, his lungs burning and his heart pounding like a drum. The Gestapo agents pursuing him were younger and faster, unburdened by the weight of documents and the knowledge that capture meant not just death, but the destruction of everything he had built. But they didn't know the city's geography the way he did, didn't understand the ancient patterns of Rome's architecture.
O'Flaherty led them on a winding route through the Trastevere district, across ancient Roman tiled roofs that groaned under his weight, through clotheslines that slapped his face and tangled his pursuers. past startled residents who had the good sense to look away and claim ignorance later. He vaulted chimneys and scrambled across slate that threatened to give way with every step. Behind him, he could hear the agents shouting coordinates to each other, trying to cut off his escape routes. The chase culminated at the edge of the Red Line. O'Flaherty found himself on a rooftop overlooking St. Peter's Square, the white-painted boundary visible in the streetlights below like a line between salvation and damnation. His pursuers were seconds behind him, their footsteps echoing on the tiles. He had two choices: surrender or make a jump that would either land him in Vatican territory or splatter him across the Roman pavement 15 feet below. O'Flaherty chose to jump. He launched himself across the gap between buildings, his arms windmilling, the satchel clutched against his chest like a child. For a terrible moment, he hung suspended over certain death, gravity clawing at him, the ground rushing up to meet him. Then his hands caught the edge of a balcony on the Vatican side, and he pulled himself over with strength born of pure survival instinct, his shoulders screaming in protest. The Gestapo agents could only watch from the other rooftop, their weapons useless across the invisible line of sovereignty that might as well have been an ocean. One of them raised his pistol anyway, but his companion knocked the weapon down, reminding him that killing a Vatican official on sovereign soil would create an international incident that even Berlin couldn't contain. O'Flaherty lay on the balcony, gasping for air, clutching documents that would save dozens of lives, mourning the man who had died so he could escape. Giuseppe Lombardi's sacrifice became another name on a list that O'Flaherty kept in a locked drawer, a catalogue of the cost of mercy in a time of madness. That night, he delivered the documents to Allied contacts and then spent hours in the empty basilica, praying for the soul of a man who had chosen heroism over survival.
By early 1944, von Kessler's patience had evaporated. The ghost of Rome had humiliated him too many times, had saved too many people who were supposed to disappear into the machinery of the final solution. The colonel's superiors in Berlin were demanding results, questioning his competence, suggesting that perhaps he was too soft for the assignment. Von Kessler decided on a bold strategy that bordered on international incident. He would surround the Vatican and force Pope Pius XII to surrender the refugees and their protector. On a freezing February morning, Nazi troops established checkpoints at every entrance to Vatican City. Armored cars patrolled the perimeter. Von Kessler himself stood at the main gate, his leather coat dusted with snow, demanding an audience with the Monsignor. The implication was clear: hand over O'Flaherty and the refugees, or face the consequences of harboring enemies of the Reich. The colonel had brought enough force to take the Vatican by storm if he chose. Sovereignty be damned. Inside the Vatican, panic rippled through the hierarchy. Cardinals argued in hushed voices about the impossibility of their position. Some advocated surrender, claiming that sacrificing one priest and his refugees was necessary to protect the broader church. Others insisted that yielding to Nazi demands would destroy the Vatican's moral authority forever. The debate grew heated, voices raised in chambers that usually echoed only with measured diplomacy. The Pope, ever cautious about maintaining the church's neutrality, called O'Flaherty to a private audience. They met in the papal apartments, just the two men and the weight of an impossible decision. Pius XII did not order O'Flaherty to surrender, but neither could he publicly support his activities. The conversation was brief, but heavy with unspoken understanding. The Monsignor was on his own, operating in the gray space between official policy and moral imperative. O'Flaherty stood at the threshold of St. Peter's Square, exactly where he had stood on that November night 3 months earlier. He could see von Kessler waiting at the Red Line,
a predator finally close to his prey, surrounded by soldiers with weapons at the ready. Monsignor lit his pipe with steady hands, took a long draw, and walked forward until he stood precisely 1 inch inside Vatican territory, so close to von Kessler that the smoke from his pipe wafted into the colonel's face. "If you're going to invade sovereign territory of the Holy See," O'Flaherty said in perfect German, his voice carrying across the square, "you'll need to cross this line, Colonel. But we both know your superiors in Berlin wouldn't sanction that particular diplomatic catastrophe, would they? Not while you still need the Vatican's cooperation in other occupied territories. Not while the Americans and British are watching how you treat neutral states." Von Kessler's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. The two men stood there for what felt like an eternity, locked in a silent battle of wills, while soldiers and Swiss guards watched from their respective sides. The colonel's hand drifted toward his sidearm, and O'Flaherty didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't give an inch of ground. Comment sanctuary if you're Team O'Flaherty. The cruelty can't win. Now watch what happens as liberation finally arrives. Finally, von Kessler stepped back. "This isn't over, Monsignor," he said quietly, his voice cold as winter wind. "Rome will not be occupied forever. And when the Allies come, when the chaos of liberation sweeps through this city, the Red Line won't protect you anymore. In the confusion of retreat, accidents happen, buildings catch fire, people disappear. Remember that." The siege lasted 3 days before Berlin ordered von Kessler to stand down. The international attention had become too problematic, with neutral countries formally protesting the violation of Vatican sovereignty and the Allies threatening consequences. Germany had larger concerns as Allied forces pushed north through Italy, and picking a fight with the Vatican was a luxury they could no longer afford. But the colonel's threat hung in the air like a promise. The endgame was approaching, and both men knew it.
June 4th, 1944. Allied tanks rolled into Rome, and the Nazi occupation collapsed with stunning speed. Von Kessler's troops retreated north, abandoning their headquarters in chaotic haste. The Black Guard, so terrifying just days before, became a flood of refugees fleeing toward the Gothic line, and O'Flaherty emerged from the Vatican to witness the liberation of the city he had fought to protect. The angel's shadow had saved approximately 4,000 lives, a figure that would never be precisely known because O'Flaherty kept no records that could be captured. Each saved life represented a small miracle of timing, courage, and desperate improvisation. 4,000 futures that would otherwise have been erased from existence now stretched forward into possibility.
But there was one final chapter to write. 3 months after liberation, O'Flaherty received word that Colonel Hans Dietrich von Kessler had been captured by Allied forces during the retreat north. He was being held in a military prison outside Rome, awaiting trial for war crimes. The evidence against him was overwhelming: testimonies from survivors, documents bearing his signature, orders for executions and deportations that traced directly to his command. Most of O'Flaherty's colleagues expected him to testify against the colonel, to ensure that justice was served with maximum severity. They anticipated righteous anger, demands for vengeance against the man who had hunted them so relentlessly. Instead, O'Flaherty requested a private meeting with the prisoner. The request baffled military authorities, but they granted it out of respect for the Monsignor's wartime service. He walked into von Kessler's cell on a September afternoon, almost exactly 1 year after the occupation had begun. The colonel sat on a narrow cot, looking smaller somehow without his uniform and authority. His ice-blue eyes still held that unsettling clarity, but something else flickered there now. Recognition of defeat, perhaps even a trace of shame. The immaculate officer who had terrorized Rome now wore a prisoner's rough clothing, his face gaunt from inadequate rations. They spoke for an hour, though the content of that conversation was never recorded. What witnesses knew was that harsh words were exchanged, that O'Flaherty confronted von Kessler with the full weight of his crimes, that the colonel defended his actions with the tired logic of orders and duty. But somewhere in that exchange, something shifted. O'Flaherty saw not just a monster, but a man who had made monstrous choices, who had buried his humanity beneath layers of ideology and obedience. O'Flaherty began visiting von Kessler regularly over the following months, bringing books, discussing philosophy and theology, gradually chipping away at the walls the colonel had built around his conscience. He spoke of redemption and forgiveness not as abstract concepts, but as difficult practices that required confronting the full horror of one's actions. Von Kessler resisted at first, then listened, then finally broke down and wept for the things he had done. The Monsignor refused to testify at the war crimes trial, stating only that he believed in the redemptive power of mercy rather than revenge. His decision outraged many survivors who wanted to see von Kessler hang. They couldn't understand how O'Flaherty could extend compassion to a man who showed none. But the Monsignor maintained that true victory over evil came not through executing its servants, but through transforming them.
Von Kessler served 9 years in prison. During that time, O'Flaherty's visits never ceased. The priest who had once stood at the red line blowing smoke in the colonel's face now sat in a cell teaching him to pray, discussing the weight of guilt and the possibility of grace. It was an unlikely friendship born from the ashes of their war, proof that even the deepest hatreds could be transformed by persistent compassion. When von Kessler was released in 1953, one of the first people waiting outside the prison gates was Hugh O'Flaherty, now grayer but still imposing, still smoking his pipe. The two men shook hands, and von Kessler, according to witnesses, wept openly. He later converted to Catholicism and worked with O'Flaherty in charitable organizations until the Monsignor's death in 1963, dedicating his remaining years to serving the very people he had once persecuted. If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you are watching this from. Represent your country. It was an ending that defied the clean narratives of heroes and villains, good and evil. O'Flaherty had spent the war saving lives at tremendous personal risk, operating a clandestine network that should have gotten him executed a dozen times over. He had danced along that red line, blown smoke in the face of genocide, and refused to let neutrality become complicity. But in the end, he also extended mercy to the man who had hunted him, because he believed that redemption was possible even for those who had served evil. The ghost of Rome became a legend in the decades that followed, a story of courage, cunning, and the radical belief that every life possesses infinite value. The angel's shadow faded back into the crypts and tunnels of history, but the 4,000 souls it saved went on to build families, create art, practice medicine, and carry forward the light that O'Flaherty had refused to let the darkness extinguish.